Storm had arrived without warning, as most terrible things do. I pressed my forehead against the frosted window of my tiny cabin, watching the snow fall in thick, merciless sheets that erased the forest beyond. The wind howled like something dying, rattling the wooden frame until I worried the whole structure might collapse around me. My breath fogged the glass, obscuring the view further, but I didn't need to see to know how brutal it was out there. The temperature had dropped so rapidly that ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows, delicate and deadly beautiful. This was my third winter alone in the cabin at the edge of pack territory. 3 winters of cold that seeped into my bones, of silence so deep it felt like drowning, of existing in the space between belonging and exile. The other Omegas lived in the main compound, in warm communal houses where they shared meals and stories and the comfort of not being forgotten. But I had been born wrong, too pale, too quiet, too sensitive to the dominance that radiated from alphas like heat from a fire. Where others bent and adapted, I broke. Where others found their place in the hierarchy, I found only pain. So they had given me this cabin. Given was perhaps too generous a word. Allowed, permitted, cast aside too. The structure was old, built decades ago as a hunting shelter, and now it served as my exile disguised as mercy. 1 room with a wood-burning stove, a narrow bed, shelves for my meager belongings, and walls so thin I could hear the forest breathing. The pack provided enough to keep me alive. Food deliveries every 2 weeks, firewood stacked outside, basic supplies, but nothing more. I was maintained, not cherished. A obligation fulfilled, not a member valued. I pulled my worn sweater tighter around myself, the fabric soft from too many washings, and returned to the stove. The fire crackled weakly, struggling against the draft that found every crack in the walls. I added another log, watching sparks dance upward, and tried not to calculate how many days of fuel I had left if this storm continued. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking wood or the settling snow. A whimper, faint and desperate, barely audible over the storm's rage. I froze, my hand still on the stove door, listening with the intensity that came from years of necessary vigilance. There it was again, closer now. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved to the door. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to ignore whatever was out there in the killing cold. Omegas didn't investigate strange sounds. Omegas stayed safe, stayed small, stayed alive by not drawing attention. But that sound, it was pain given voice, suffering that called to something deep inside me, something that had survived despite everything this world had tried to teach me about knowing my place. I grabbed my heaviest coat from the hook, pulled on boots that were more holes than leather, and wrapped a scarf around my face. The moment I opened the door, the wind tried to tear it from my hands, and snow blasted into the cabin with such force I gasped. The cold was a physical assault, stealing the breath from my lungs, turning my exposed skin numb in seconds. Hello? My voice was lost immediately, swallowed by the storm. I stepped out onto the small porch, squinting against the white chaos. At first, I saw nothing but snow and darkness, and the skeletal shadows of trees bending under the wind's assault. Then movement caught my eye. Something dark against the white, shapes that didn't belong to the forest's natural geometry. 2 forms lay in the snow at the edge of my small clearing, perhaps 20 feet from the cabin. Large forms, wolf forms. My breath caught for an entirely different reason now. Wolves, black as midnight against the snow, barely visible in the storm's fury. Even from this distance, even collapsed and clearly injured, they were massive, easily twice the size of normal wolves, which meant they weren't normal wolves at all. They were shifters. Alphas, most likely, given their size. Everything in my training, in my survival instincts, in my painful history, told me to go back inside. Lock the door. Pretend I had seen nothing. Alphas were dangerous even when healthy and well-disposed. Injured alphas were unpredictable, violent, capable of lashing out at anyone nearby when pain and instinct took over. And I was an Omega, the lowest rank, the most vulnerable, the easiest to hurt. But that whimper came again, weaker now, fading, and I thought about how it felt to be left in the cold, to be considered not worth the effort of saving, to be alone when you most needed someone to care that you existed. I had spent 3 years learning what that felt like. I couldn't do that to another living being, no matter how dangerous they might be. The decision made itself, really. My body moved before my mind finished cataloging all the ways this could destroy me. I trudged through snow that came up to my knees, fighting the wind that tried to push me back toward the cabin, toward safety, toward the sensible choice. Ice formed on my eyelashes. My fingers went numb inside my gloves. But I pushed forward until I reached the first wolf. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His fur was pure black, so dark it seemed to absorb what little light existed in the storm. Blood matted his shoulder and side. I could see it even in the darkness, a wet sheen that shouldn't be there. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the sound of a body struggling to maintain basic functions. "Hey," I whispered, kneeling beside him despite every screaming instinct. "Hey, can you hear me?" His eye cracked open. Just one. The other was swollen shut, and I found myself staring into a gaze that was disturbingly human despite the wolf form. Intelligence lived in that eye, awareness, and something else. Surprise, maybe, that anyone had come. "I'm going to help you," I told him, though I had no idea if he could understand in this form, if he was too far gone into his wolf's instincts to comprehend human speech. "I'm going to get you inside, both of you." The second wolf lay a few feet away, equally massive, equally black, equally broken. Brothers, perhaps. Pack members, certainly. The bond between them was visible even like this, the way they had collapsed reaching toward each other, the way the first wolf's gaze flickered to his companion despite his own agony. I had no idea how I was going to move them. They each outweighed me by at least 100 pounds, probably more. But I had spent 3 years chopping wood, hauling water, surviving on the edge of pack territory through physical labor that Omegas in the compound never had to perform. I was stronger than I looked, even if I was still fundamentally weak by shifter standards. I positioned myself beside the first wolf and worked my arms under his bulk. His fur was frozen in places, ice crystals clinging to the black strands. Up close, I could smell blood and something else, a scent that was distinctly alpha, heavy with dominance and power even in this reduced state. "On 3, I muttered to myself. 1, 2, 3. I heaved with everything I had, my legs shaking with effort, my back screaming in protest. He was impossibly heavy, dead weight made worse by injury and unconsciousness, but I managed to lift his front half, to drag him a few inches through the snow, then a few more inches, then a foot. The cabin had never seemed so far away. The wind fought me for every step, and my muscles burned with lactic acid, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. If I stopped, I'd never get started again, and they would die out here in the cold that I knew too intimately. It took me nearly 20 minutes to drag the first wolf to the cabin. By the time I wrestled him through the door and onto the floor near the stove, I was shaking with exhaustion and hypothermia, my vision swimming with dark spots, but I forced myself back out into the storm. The second wolf was even harder to move. He was slightly larger, his injuries more extensive, and my strength was nearly gone. Halfway to the cabin, I slipped on ice and fell hard, landing on my knees with a crack that sent pain shooting up my legs. The wolf's weight pressed down on me, and for a long moment, I thought I couldn't do it, that I had made a terrible mistake, that I would freeze out here trying to save creatures who would probably kill me when they woke. But I thought about the way the first wolf's eye had looked at me, the surprise in it, the recognition that someone had chosen to help when help wasn't deserved or expected. I knew that feeling. I got up. By the time I dragged the second wolf inside and closed the door against the screaming wind, I couldn't feel my hands or feet. My clothes were soaked through, frozen stiff in places, and ice had formed in my hair. The cabin that had felt so cold before now seemed almost warm by comparison, though I knew that was dangerous thinking. The sign that hypothermia was setting in. But first, the wolves. I built up the fire until it roared, feeding it logs I couldn't afford to spare, until heat radiated through the small space. Then I grabbed every blanket I owned, all 3 of them, thin and worn but better than nothing, and draped them over the 2 black forms on my floor. They were both unconscious now, their breathing shallow but steady. The blood on their fur was still wet, which meant the wounds weren't clotting properly. I had basic first aid supplies, things the pack provided for emergencies, but I had no idea how to treat injured shifters. Were they more like humans or more like animals in this form? Would normal medicine work? Would it harm them? I did what I could, cleaned the visible wounds with warm water, applied pressure to the worst of the bleeding, kept them warm. My hands shook the entire time, from cold and fear and exhaustion and the sheer impossibility of what I had just done. 2 alphas, in my cabin, unconscious and vulnerable and entirely at my mercy, which would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. When I had done everything my limited knowledge allowed, I finally let myself collapse. I stripped off my frozen clothes with numb fingers, pulled on dry layers, and huddled near the stove with a cup of tea that I barely had the strength to prepare. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, there was only the crackling of the fire and the sound of labored breathing, theirs and mine. All of us survivors of the cold, at least for now. I should have been afraid. I should have been planning what to do when they woke, how to protect myself, how to explain to the pack what I had done. But exhaustion pulled at me like a riptide, and my eyes kept drifting closed despite my best efforts. The warmth of the fire, the adrenaline crash, the physical toll of dragging 2 massive wolves through a blizzard. It all caught up with me at once. The last thing I saw before sleep claimed me was the steady rise and fall of black fur in the firelight, and the strange comfort of not being alone in the cold for the first time in 3 years. I didn't hear the first wolf's eye open again in the darkness, didn't see the way he watched me sleep, his gaze fixed on the small Omega who had saved them both. Something like wonder mixing with the pain in his expression. Didn't know that everything was about to change. The storm howled its approval, and the night pressed close around us all. I woke to silence, not the comfortable silence of solitude, but the heavy, watchful silence of being observed. My eyes opened slowly, confused by the quality of light filtering through the windows, pale and clean, the particular brightness that came after a storm had passed and left the world covered in fresh snow. How long had I slept? Memory returned in fragments. The storm, the whimpering, the 2 massive black wolves bleeding in the snow. My heart lurched, and I sat up too quickly, my stiff muscles screaming in protest. The blanket I'd wrapped around myself fell away, and cold air hit my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. They were still there. Both wolves lay near the stove, exactly where I'd left them, but everything about them had changed. They were awake now, their eyes open and fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. In the morning light, I could see them properly for the first time. The sheer size of them, the intelligence in their gazes, the raw power that emanated from them even in their injured state. The closer one, the first I'd dragged inside, had eyes like molten gold. His companions were darker, amber touched with green. Both sets of eyes tracked my every movement with predatory focus that sent primitive warning signals firing through my nervous system. I was alone in a tiny cabin with 2 alpha wolves who could tear me apart without effort. "Good morning," I said softly, my voice rough from sleep and screaming against the wind. The absurdity of the greeting wasn't lost on me. But what else did you say to strange alphas who had spent the night on your floor? Neither wolf moved, but something shifted in the golden-eyed one's expression. Recognition, maybe, or acknowledgement that I was speaking to them as people, not animals. I rose carefully, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening, and moved toward the small kitchen area. My legs wobbled. I'd pushed them too hard last night, and they were letting me know about it. Every muscle in my body ached, a deep soreness that promised I'd feel worse tomorrow. "You must be thirsty," I said, still keeping my voice low and gentle. "I'm going to get you some water. I'm not going to hurt you. Obviously." I almost laughed at that, as if I could hurt them, as if I posed any threat whatsoever to creatures like these. I filled 2 large bowls with water from my dwindling supply and approached them carefully, watching for any sign of aggression. The golden-eyed wolf watched me come closer, his body tense but not hostile. When I set the bowl near him, he lowered his head slowly and drank, his tongue lapping at the water with desperate thirst. The second wolf was slower to respond, his injuries clearly more severe, but he eventually pulled himself toward the bowl I'd placed near him and drank as well. While they focused on the water, I took the opportunity to examine their wounds in daylight. The bleeding had stopped, which was something, but the injuries were extensive, deep gashes that looked like they'd come from claws or teeth. They'd been in a fight, clearly, and barely escaped with their lives. "What happened to you?" I asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Shifters couldn't speak in wolf form, couldn't communicate beyond growls and body language, but I'd spent so much time alone that talking to myself, or to them, felt natural. The golden-eyed wolf finished drinking and turned his attention back to me. There was something disconcerting about that gaze, the way it seemed to see too much, to understand too much. He made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between that conveyed frustration. He wanted to shift back, I realized. Wanted to speak, to explain, but couldn't. Either the injuries prevented it, or he was too weak, or something else held him in this form. "It's okay," I told him, though I had no idea if anything was okay. "You're safe here. You can shift when you're ready, or not. Whatever you need." I spent the next hour trying to make us all more comfortable. I prepared a thin soup from my limited supplies, mostly broth and some vegetables that were starting to turn, and managed to coax both wolves to eat small amounts. The golden-eyed one was more alert, more responsive, while his companion drifted in and out of consciousness in a way that worried me. The morning stretched into afternoon, and the silence of the forest outside remained absolute. No birds, no wind, just the muffled quiet that came after heavy snow. It was peaceful in a way that felt ominous, like the world was holding its breath. I was checking the second wolf's wounds again, my fingers gentle on his matted fur, when I heard it. Footsteps. Multiple sets, crunching through snow. My hands froze, my heart immediately jumping into my throat. The golden-eyed wolf's head snapped toward the door, his ears flattening against his skull. A low growl rumbled through his chest, and beside him, his companion stirred, trying to rise despite his weakness. "Shh," I whispered urgently, my hand still on the injured wolf's side. "It's okay, just a knock on the door." Sharp, authoritative, the kind of knock that wasn't asking for permission, but announcing intention. I looked at the two wolves, at their injuries, at the evidence of what I'd done scattered around my cabin, bloody water, torn blankets, bowls on the floor. There was no hiding this, no explaining it away. I'd saved two strange alphas, brought them into my home, and now someone knew. The knock came again, harder this time. "We know you're in there. Open the door." The voice was female, sharp with authority. Cassandra, I realized with a sinking feeling, one of the pack's senior enforcers, an alpha female who had never bothered to hide her disdain for me. I moved to the door on shaking legs, my mind racing through possibilities and finding nothing but bad outcomes. My hand hesitated on the handle. "Now," Cassandra commanded. I opened the door. The sight that greeted me stole what little breath I had left. My small clearing, which yesterday had been empty except for snow and trees, was now surrounded. Wolves, at least 20 of them, formed a loose circle around my cabin, their bodies dark against the white landscape. Some were in wolf form, some had shifted to human, and stood in the cold with the casual indifference of alphas who didn't feel temperature the way I did. And in the center, standing on my porch with two other enforcers flanking her, was Cassandra. She was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was all hard angles and harder eyes. She looked at me the way someone might look at something unpleasant they'd found on their shoe. "Well?" she said, her gaze moving past me to take in the scene inside the cabin. "This is interesting." I couldn't speak. My voice had abandoned me entirely, fled in the face of this show of force, this casual display of the power differential between us. Cassandra pushed past me without waiting for invitation, her enforcers following. They filled my small cabin immediately, making it feel even more cramped, their alpha presence pressing against my senses until I wanted to curl into a ball and disappear. The golden-eyed wolf struggled to his feet, swaying dangerously, positioning himself between the enforcers and his injured companion. The growl in his chest was continuous now, a warning that transcended species. "Stand down," Cassandra said, but not to him. She was looking at her enforcers who had tensed at the wolf's aggression. "Can't you smell it? That's River's line. Both of them." River. The name meant something, clearly, from the way the other enforcers reacted. A mixture of shock and something that looked like fear. "Their pack?" one of the enforcers asked, a younger male who couldn't hide his surprise. "Not just pack," Cassandra said, still studying the wolves with an expression I couldn't read. "That's the Alpha's sons, Damon and Cole." The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the fire. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications crashed over me like a wave. I hadn't just saved 2 random alphas. I had saved the pack alpha's sons, the heirs, the most powerful, most protected, most important members of the entire pack. And I had dragged them through the snow, stuffed them in my tiny cabin, and treated their injuries with my complete lack of medical training. "How?" I started, but my voice cracked. "How did you know they were here?" Cassandra turned her sharp gaze on me, and I fought the urge to take a step back. Because every alpha in the pack felt the bond snap into awareness at dawn. Because their father has been tearing the forest apart looking for them since they disappeared 2 nights ago. Because the whole pack knows that 2 of our strongest went out to track the rogues who've been testing our borders and never came back. 2 nights ago. They'd been lying in the snow for hours before I found them then, had been that close to death. "The trail led here," Cassandra continued, "to the Omega at the edge of territory. Though why it led here, I can't begin to imagine. The way she said, 'the Omega,' made it clear what she thought of me, and what she thought of my chances of being anything other than a problem to be dealt with. She helped us." Everyone froze. The voice that had spoken was rough, strained, barely human, but undeniably human. I spun toward the wolves and found that the golden-eyed one was shifting, his form flowing and changing in a way that should have been impossible given his injuries. The transformation took longer than it should have, clearly causing him pain, but he pushed through it with grim determination. When it was complete, a man knelt where the wolf had been, tall even kneeling, powerfully built despite the blood and wounds that marked his body. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome if it wasn't currently twisted with pain and exhaustion, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and those same golden eyes that had watched me so intently. He wore nothing, as shifters never did immediately after transformation, but someone thrust clothes at him, and he pulled them on with movements that were slow and careful. "She saved us," he said, his voice stronger now, directed at Cassandra, but his eyes on me. "We were dying in the cold. She brought us in, cared for us, kept us alive through the night." "She's an Omega," Cassandra said, as if that explained everything, as if it negated everything. "She's brave," the man, Damon apparently, corrected. "Braver than anyone else would have been. How many of your trained enforcers would have risked themselves for wounded strangers in a storm? How many would have even looked?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because everyone knew the truth. Alphas didn't risk themselves for unknowns, didn't expose themselves to potential danger for strangers who might turn on them the moment they woke. But I had. Because I was Omega, and Omegas understood what it meant to be left in the cold. Cassandra's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to me, and something in her expression had shifted slightly. Not warmth, exactly, but perhaps a degree less contempt. "The Alpha is coming," she said. "He'll want to see them. To see this." She gestured at the cabin, at the evidence of my night's work. At me standing there in my worn clothes with my pale hair a mess, and my hands still stained with blood from treating their wounds. "Of course," I managed to say, though the thought of meeting the Alpha, the most powerful shifter in the pack, the ultimate authority, made my knees weak. Damon was still looking at me, and there was something in his gaze that I couldn't interpret. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. Names had power in shifter culture. Giving your name to an Alpha was a sign of trust, of acknowledgement. "Emma." I finally said. My name is Emma. Emma, he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. Thank you, Emma. For our lives. Before I could respond, the circle of wolves outside began to shift, to part, creating a path through their ranks. I felt it before I saw it, a presence so powerful it made the air itself feel heavier, made every instinct I possessed scream at me to lower my eyes, to submit, to make myself as small and unthreatening as possible. The Alpha was here, and my life, I knew with absolute certainty, would never be the same. He filled the doorway like a force of nature. The Alpha, River, I remembered Cassandra calling him, was a man who commanded attention without effort, whose very presence seemed to bend the world around him. He was tall, broader than his sons, with silver threading through dark hair that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. His face was all sharp planes and hard edges, the kind of face that had seen violence and survived it, that had made difficult decisions and never looked back. But it was his eyes that truly captured attention. Pale gray, like winter ice, and just as cold. They swept over the assembled wolves, over Cassandra and her enforcers, over his injured sons, and finally landed on me. I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to drop my eyes, to bow my head, to show submission to a predator so far above me in the hierarchy that we might as well be different species. My knees actually buckled slightly, and I had to lock them to stay upright. Father. Damon's voice was steady despite his injuries, despite the obvious exhaustion that lined his face. He remained kneeling, one hand braced against the floor, but his spine was straight. Proud. River's attention shifted to his son, and something flickered in those cold eyes. Relief, perhaps, though it was gone too quickly to be certain. He moved into the cabin with 3 long strides, and suddenly the space felt impossibly small, impossibly crowded with alpha energy that pressed against my skin like static electricity. You're hurt, River said, and though his tone was flat, something underneath it suggested emotion held under rigid control. We're alive, Damon replied. Thanks to her. That gaze swung back to me, and this time it lingered, studying me with an intensity that made my skin flush hot, then cold. I forced myself to meet his eyes for just a moment, long enough to show respect but not challenge, before dropping my gaze to somewhere around his chest. Explain, River commanded, and the word wasn't a request. Damon did, his voice growing rougher as he recounted what had happened. They'd been tracking the rogues, he said, following a trail that had led deep into the mountains. They'd found the camp, counted at least 15 hostiles, and were pulling back to report when they were ambushed. A second group had circled behind them, cutting off their retreat. We fought, Damon said simply, as if describing something mundane rather than what must have been a brutal battle for survival. Took down 6 of them before we broke through their line. But we were bleeding badly, disoriented. The storm hit, and we couldn't tell which direction was home. He paused, his eyes finding mine again across the crowded cabin. We were dying. I knew it. Cole knew it. We'd shifted to conserve energy, but it wasn't enough. The cold was taking us down faster than the wounds. And then I heard her voice. She came out in the storm, he continued. And something that might have been wonder touched his voice. This small omega, barely visible in the snow, and she dragged us both inside, treated our wounds, kept us warm, saved us. Silence followed his words, the kind of silence that felt heavy with judgment, with evaluation, with decisions being made that would affect lives. River's gaze hadn't left me. You dragged 2 full-grown alpha wolves through a blizzard by yourself? Yes, Alpha, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Why had I risked everything for strangers? Why had I ignored every instinct, every lesson learned through painful experience, every rational thought that told me to stay safe behind my locked door? They needed help, I said finally, the truth too simple to be anything but honest. I couldn't leave them to die in the cold. Something flickered across River's face. Too quick to catch, too complex to interpret, most would have. He said quietly. Most should have. given your position in the pack. Alphas are dangerous, especially injured ones, especially strange ones you don't know. I know, I said, but being afraid of what might happen seemed less important than doing what needed to be done. Cassandra made a sound that might have been disapproval or disbelief. River silenced her with a glance, then turned his attention to where Cole still lay near the stove, conscious now, but clearly in more pain than his brother. "Can you shift?" River asked him. Cole's response was a low whine that communicated pain and frustration in equal measure. He tried. I could see the effort in the tensing of his muscles, the way his form wavered slightly, but nothing happened. Whatever injuries he'd sustained had damaged something essential, had locked him in his wolf form until he healed enough to change. River's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We need to get you both to the pack doctor." "Can you walk?" "I can," Damon said, pushing himself to his feet with visible effort. He swayed, and 2 enforcers moved to steady him, but he waved them off. "Cole will need to be carried. We brought a transport," Cassandra said. "We can shift him." "I'll carry him," River interrupted. "He's my son." The statement was simple, but the weight behind it spoke of pack dynamics I didn't fully understand, of pride and responsibility, and the bonds between alpha family members that ran deeper than blood. River moved to Cole and knelt beside him, speaking in a low voice too quiet for the rest of us to hear. Then, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing presence, he gathered the massive wolf into his arms and stood. The display of strength was casual, effortless, the kind of power that needed no announcement. "Cassandra," River said as he moved toward the door, "take Damon to the doctor. Make sure he's fully checked, everything documented. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with, exactly how close." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood how close they'd come to losing them. "Yes, Alpha," Cassandra said, all business now as she moved to help Damon toward the door. River paused at the threshold, turning back to look at me one more time. "You'll come to the main house," he said, and it wasn't a request. "Tonight. There are things we need to discuss." My heart hammered against my ribs. Being summoned to the Alpha's house, to the center of pack power, was not something that happened to Omegas like me, ever. "Yes, Alpha," I managed to say. He studied me for another long moment, those pale eyes seeming to see past skin and bone to something underneath. Then he was gone, moving through the door with Cole cradled carefully in his arms, the circle of wolves parting before him like water before a ship's bow. The enforcers followed, helping Damon down the porch steps and through the snow. Cassandra was the last to leave, and she paused in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You've caught their attention," she said quietly, and I couldn't tell if it was a warning or an observation. That's not always a good thing for an Omega. Then she too was gone, pulling the door closed behind her, and I was alone again in my cabin, but it didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt like the eye of a storm, like the brief moment of calm before everything changed forever. I moved to the window and watched the procession make its way through the snow, the Alpha carrying one son, enforcers supporting the other, the pack wolves falling into formation around them like an honor guard. They were beautiful and terrible, powerful and coordinated, everything I had never been and would never be. And I had saved 2 of them. The thought was surreal. 3 years of existing on the edges, of being forgotten and dismissed and tolerated at best. And now, what? What did this mean? What did River want to discuss? What were the consequences of breaking the unspoken rule that Omegas didn't interfere in Alpha business, even to save lives? I spent the rest of the day in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion, cleaning the cabin with trembling hands, trying to erase the evidence of the night before, even though it was far too late for that. The blood came out of the floor with enough scrubbing, but the memory of it, of them, of golden eyes watching me in the firelight, that wouldn't wash away so easily. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of amber and rose, I forced myself to prepare. I bathed in cold water, scrubbing away days of grime, and braided my pale hair back from my face. I had nothing appropriate to wear to meet an Alpha. My clothes were all practical, worn, designed for survival rather than presentation. but I chose the least damaged sweater and my only pair of pants without visible patches. When full darkness fell, I made my way through the forest toward the main compound. The path was familiar from my supply runs, but it felt different in the dark. Every shadow potentially hiding watchers. Every sound carrying new weight. The main house rose before me like something from another world, 3 stories of stone and timber, windows glowing warm with light, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. It was beautiful in a way that hurt. A reminder of everything I had been exiled from. Everything I would never have. I climbed the steps to the wide front porch, my breath clouding in the cold air, and raised my hand to knock. The door opened before my knuckles touched wood. River stood there, still imposing even in the casual clothes he'd changed into, his pale eyes finding mine immediately. "Emma," he said, my name strange in his deep voice. "Come in." I stepped across the threshold, and the warmth of the house enveloped me like an embrace. The interior was as impressive as the exterior. High ceilings, comfortable furniture, the scent of pine and wood smoke and something else. Something distinctly Pack, distinctly home. "This way," River said, leading me through the house to a study lined with books and dominated by a large desk. A fire crackled in the hearth, and 2 chairs sat before it, positioned for conversation. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. I sat, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. River took the other chair, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the space between us. "My sons are healing well," he said finally. "The doctor says they'll make full recoveries, thanks to your quick action. Another hour in that cold, and we would have lost them both. I'm glad they're okay," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "You should understand what you saved," River continued, his gaze intense. "Damon and Cole aren't just my sons. They're the future of this pack. Their loss would have created a power vacuum, would have invited challenges from rival packs, would have put every member of this pack at risk. You saved more than 2 lives last night. You may have saved us all. I hadn't thought of it that way. Hadn't thought beyond the immediate need, the suffering and the snow. I didn't do it for political reasons," I said quietly. "I did it because it was right." "I know," River said. "That's what makes it remarkable. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and you did it anyway." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been thinking about you all day, about the Omega at the edge of my territory who lives alone in a cabin that should have been condemned years ago. About why someone like you would be placed so far from the protection of the pack." My breath caught. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could expose wounds better left covered. "I checked your file," River continued relentlessly, "saw that you were deemed too sensitive for pack life, that the proximity to alpha dominance caused you physical pain. That exile was presented as mercy rather than punishment." "It was mercy," I said automatically, the old defense rising without thought. "Was it?" River asked, and his voice was gentle in a way that made my eyes burn with tears I refused to shed. "Or was it easier to remove you than to make accommodations? Easier to forget than to care?" I couldn't answer that. Couldn't speak past the sudden tightness in my throat. "Things are going to change," River said, and it sounded like a promise and a threat all at once. "Starting now." The words hung in the air between us, weighted with implications I couldn't fully grasp. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely steady. River stood, moving to the window that overlooked the compound. From here, I could see other houses, lights in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, all the signs of pack life that I had been removed from. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette dark against the glass. "My sons owe you a life debt," he said. "In our culture, that's not something to be taken lightly. It creates a bond, an obligation that transcends normal pack hierarchy. I don't want anything from them," I said quickly. "I didn't help them expecting—" "I know," River interrupted, turning to face me. "Which is precisely why the debt stands. You acted without expectation of reward, without calculation of benefit. That kind of selflessness is rare, Emma, especially in a world that has given you every reason to look the other way." He moved back to his chair, sitting with the kind of controlled grace that spoke of decades of absolute authority. But there's more to this than a simple life debt. You've demonstrated qualities that this pack needs: courage, compassion, the ability to act decisively in crisis, qualities that aren't determined by rank or biology, but by character. I didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken to me about character before, about having value beyond the Omega designation that defined my entire existence. I've decided to offer you a choice, River continued. You can remain in your cabin, and we'll ensure it's properly winterized, properly supplied. You'll never want for anything material, and the life debt will be considered satisfied through our care. He paused, his pale eyes searching mine. Or you can come back to the compound. Not as you were before, not in the Omega quarters where the proximity to Alpha energy made you suffer, but in a position of your own. We have a cottage. Small, private, at the edge of the residential area, but still within the protection of the pack. You would have your space, your solitude when you need it, but also access to the community, to meals, to company, to belonging. The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything I had imagined, that for a moment I couldn't process it. Return to the compound? After 3 years of exile? After I had finally learned how to survive alone? Why? I asked, because I needed to understand. Why would you do this? Because my sons asked me to, River said simply. Because they spent the day telling me about the Omega who sang to them while she cleaned their wounds, who talked to them like people rather than beasts, who stayed awake through the night to make sure they kept breathing. Because Damon said you have the gentlest hands he's ever known, and Cole, who hasn't been able to shift back yet, keeps whining at the door like he's trying to find his way back to you. The image of the massive black wolf whining at a door made something in my chest tighten painfully. And because, River continued, his voice dropping lower, I've spent 3 years believing I made the right choice in sending you away. Believing that exile was kindness, that it protected both you and the pack from an incompatibility that couldn't be resolved. But watching you today, seeing the evidence of what you accomplished alone, in conditions that would have broken most wolves, I'm no longer certain I was right. It was as close to an apology as an alpha could give, I realized. An admission of potential error, of misjudgment, wrapped in the authority to make new choices. I need time to think, I said, because it was the truth. My mind was spinning, unable to grasp the enormity of what was being offered, what it would mean to return, to be visible again after so long invisible. Of course, River said, standing. Take the time you need, but Emma... He waited until I met his eyes. You should know that regardless of what you choose, you're under pack protection now. The rogues that attacked my sons are still out there, and they'll be looking for weaknesses to exploit. You've become visible in a way that can't be undone. Staying isolated isn't as safe as it once was. The warning was clear, practical, and terrifying. I had thought myself beneath notice, too insignificant to be threatened. But I had interfered in something larger, had altered the trajectory of events in ways I couldn't predict. I understand, I said quietly. River walked me to the door, and as I stepped out into the cold night, he spoke once more. They want to see you. Damon and Cole, when you're ready. They're in the medical wing recovering, but they've been asking about you. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and made my way down the steps. The walk back through the forest felt different now. Not lonely, exactly, but heavy with awareness of watching eyes, of boundaries shifting, of a future that had suddenly become uncertain in ways that were both frightening and oddly thrilling. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight and the sound of voices outside my cabin. I looked out the window to find 3 pack members. None of them alphas, I could tell from the way they moved, the energy they projected, unloading supplies from a truck. Food, firewood, blankets, tools, things I hadn't requested but clearly needed. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled when she saw me watching. Alpha's orders, she called out, said to make sure you have everything you need. I helped them unload, grateful for the distraction, for the normalcy of physical labor. They were friendly but respectful of my space, leaving once everything was stacked on the porch. As they drove away, I noticed something else, 2 wolves in the tree line, watching. Guards, I realized. River had meant what he said about protection. I spent the day trying to return to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. My hands went through the motions of cleaning, organizing, preparing meals, but my mind was elsewhere, in the main house, in the medical wing, wondering how they were healing, if they really had asked about me, if any of this was real, or some elaborate dream brought on by isolation and loneliness. As afternoon faded toward evening, I made a decision. I needed to see them. Needed to know if the gratitude in Damon's voice had been real, if the connection I thought I'd felt was more than my desperate imagination. I changed into cleaner clothes, braided my hair again, and made the walk to the main compound. The guards in the forest followed at a discreet distance, their presence both comforting and unnerving. The main house felt less intimidating in daylight, though no less impressive. A different pack member answered my knock, a young beta female who smiled warmly and seemed unsurprised to see me. "You're Emma," she said, not a question. "They've been hoping you'd come. Follow me." She led me through the house to a wing I hadn't seen the night before, where the scent of antiseptic mixed with the warmer smells of pack. The medical wing was clean and well-equipped, with several rooms branching off a central hallway. "They're in here," the beta said, stopping at a door near the end of the hall. "They're doing much better, but Cole still can't shift, so don't be alarmed." She knocked once, then opened the door. The room beyond was large and comfortable, more like a bedroom than a hospital space. Late afternoon light streamed through windows that overlooked the forest, illuminating 2 figures, one in the bed, one sitting beside it. Damon stood when I entered, and I was struck by how different he looked cleaned up, dressed in soft clothes, his wounds bandaged properly. He was, I realized with a flutter of awareness I tried to suppress, devastatingly handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with those golden eyes that seemed to see straight through defenses. "Emma," he said, and his whole face transformed with a smile that made my breath catch. "You came." On the bed, a massive black wolf lifted his head, and I recognized those amber-green eyes immediately. Cole made a sound, part whine, part greeting, and his tail thumped weakly against the covers. "Hi," I said, feeling suddenly awkward, uncertain of my place in this space. With these people who were so far above me in every way that mattered, I wanted to see how you were doing. "Better," Damon said, gesturing to a chair near the bed. "Please sit. We've been hoping you'd visit." I sat carefully, my eyes moving between them. "You look much better," I told Damon. "The color's back in your face. The doctor said I was lucky," Damon replied, his expression sobering. "Said the wounds were deep enough to be fatal if they'd gone untreated much longer. Said whoever stopped the bleeding and kept us warm saved our lives." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "Thank you, Emma. I don't think I said that properly yesterday. Thank you for our lives." "You don't need to keep thanking me," I said, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the weight of it. "Anyone would have—" "No," Damon interrupted gently. "They wouldn't have. And you know it." He was right, of course. I did know it. Had known it when I made the choice to go out into the storm, when I dragged them through the snow, when I brought them into my home despite every logical reason not to. Cole made another sound, and I turned my attention to him. His eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin warm. I reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted, and laid my hand on his head. His fur was clean now, soft, and he leaned into the touch with a rumble that was almost a purr. "The doctor says his injuries are healing well," Damon explained, "but something about the trauma has locked him in wolf form. It's not permanent. It shouldn't be, anyway. But until whatever internal damage exists finishes healing, he's stuck like this." "Does it hurt?" I asked Cole, though I knew he couldn't answer, but something in his eyes communicated understanding, and he huffed a breath that might have been a no. "He wants you to know he's not dangerous," Damon translated, reading his brother with the ease of lifelong familiarity. "Wants you to know you don't have to be afraid." "I'm not afraid," I said, and realized it was true. I should be. These were alphas, powerful and unpredictable, but sitting here with them, watching Cole lean into my touch, seeing the genuine warmth in Damon's eyes. I felt safe in a way I hadn't in years. We talked as the light faded outside, easy conversation that flowed naturally despite the strangeness of the situation. Damon told me about growing up in the pack, about learning to navigate pack politics and power structures, about the pressure of being the alpha's heir. Cole added his own commentary through huffs and tail movements that his brother interpreted with practiced ease. "He says you have a terrible singing voice," Damon said at one point, grinning at Cole's series of sounds. "Says you were torturing him all night with off-key lullabies." I felt my face heat. I didn't realize. Cole's tail thumped harder, and Damon laughed. "He's teasing. He says it was actually the most comforting thing he's ever heard, that he focused on your voice to stay conscious, to keep fighting." The words hit me harder than they should have, striking something deep and vulnerable that I usually kept locked away. Cole was watching me with those intelligent eyes, and I saw the truth in them. He meant it. Every word his brother had translated. "I'm glad I could help," I managed to say past the tightness in my throat. "Father told us about his offer," Damon said after a moment, his tone more serious. "About the cottage. We hope you'll consider it." "I am," I said carefully. "It's just a lot to think about. I've been on my own for 3 years. I'm not sure I know how to be part of a community anymore." "You don't have to decide right away," Damon said, "but Emma, you should know that it's not just Father who wants you closer. Cole and I—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We'd like to get to know you better, to understand the person who saved us." There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, that made my pulse quicken, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond simple friendship. Cole made a sound of agreement, his eyes warm on mine. "I'd like that too," I admitted quietly, and saw the way both brothers seemed to relax, as if they'd been holding their breath waiting for my response. We stayed like that as darkness fell completely outside, talking and laughing and simply being together in a way that felt both natural and impossibly significant. When I finally rose to leave, both Damon and Cole seemed reluctant to see me go. "Come back tomorrow?" Damon asked, walking me to the door. "Please?" "Okay," I said, and meant it. He smiled, and it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. As I walked home through the dark forest, my guards shadowing me at a discreet distance, I realized something had shifted inside me. The fear that had defined so much of my existence was still there, still real, but it was smaller now, quieter. And in its place, something new was growing, something that felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm I had never experienced before, a pattern of connection that slowly rewove the fabric of my isolated existence into something richer, more textured, more alive. I visited Damon and Cole every afternoon, bringing small things from my cabin. Wildflowers I'd found growing against the southern wall despite the snow, stories about the birds that visited my porch, sketches I'd made of the forest in winter. They seemed to treasure these offerings more than they should have, treating my simple gifts like precious artifacts. Cole recovered slowly but steadily. On the 5th day, I arrived to find him in human form for the first time, tall like his brother but leaner, with dark hair that fell into eyes that were even more striking in his human face than they had been in his wolf form. He was quieter than Damon, more reserved, but when he smiled it was like watching ice melt in spring. "Thank you," were the first words he spoke to me, his voice rough from disuse. "For everything." I had learned by then not to deflect their gratitude, to simply accept it with grace. "You're welcome," I said, and watched relief cross his features. The 3 of us spent hours together in that medical wing room, talking about everything and nothing. They told me about pack dynamics I had never understood, about the complex web of alliances and rivalries that governed shifter society. I told them about my life in the cabin, about learning to survive alone, about finding beauty in solitude even when loneliness threatened to consume me. "You're stronger than you know," Cole said one afternoon, his amber-green eyes serious. "Most wolves would have broken under that kind of isolation, but you thrived." "I'm not sure I'd call it thriving," I said with a small laugh. "More like persistent surviving. That's a kind of strength too," Damon argued, leaning forward in his chair. the kind that matters most when everything else fails. Their respect for me was evident in every word, every gesture, every look, and slowly, carefully, something deeper began to grow between us. A connection that went beyond gratitude, beyond the life debt, beyond the simple friendship I had told myself was all this could be. I noticed it in the way Damon's eyes tracked my movements around the room, in the way Cole's face softened when I spoke, in the tension that hummed in the air when our hands accidentally brushed. It was attraction, undeniable and growing stronger with each passing day, but complicated by everything we were: alpha heirs and an omega outcast, people from different worlds who should never have intersected. On the 10th day, River summoned me again. I found him in his study, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He gestured to the same chair I'd occupied before, and I sat with less trepidation this time, growing accustomed to his presence. "The rogues attacked the northern border 2 nights ago," he said without preamble. "A dozen of them testing our defenses. We drove them back, but they're getting bolder." My stomach tightened with worry. Did anyone get hurt? Minor injuries only, but Emma... He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "They're looking for weaknesses, and word has spread about what you did, about the Alpha's sons being saved by an Omega from the edge of territory. Some see that as a story of courage and compassion. Others see it as opportunity." "You think they'll come for me," I said, understanding immediately. "I think you've become visible in ways that make you vulnerable," River corrected. "Which is why I need your decision. The cabin is no longer safe, even with guards. If you stay there, you're exposed. But the cottage I mentioned, it's within the compound's inner defenses, protected by the full strength of the pack." He pulled a key from his pocket and set it on the desk between us. "I have had it prepared for you, furnished, stocked with supplies, everything you need. The choice is still yours, Emma, but I'm asking you to choose the option that keeps you alive." I looked at the key. Small, brass, ordinary, except for what it represented. A return to pack life, a chance at belonging, a risk that the pain and rejection I'd experienced before might return, might be even worse for having hoped it could be different. "My sons would like you to accept," River added quietly. "They've made that abundantly clear, as has half the pack, apparently. The story of what you did has resonated. People want to meet you, to thank you, to understand the Omega who had the courage they lacked." "I'm not brave," I said, the old defense rising automatically. "I was just willing to act when action was needed," River finished. "That's the definition of courage, Emma. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it." I reached for the key, my fingers closing around the cool metal. "Okay," I said, the word both surrender and declaration. "I'll try. I'll come back." Something that might have been approval flickered across River's face. "Good. We'll help you move your things tomorrow. And Emma..." He waited until I met his eyes. "Thank you for saving my sons, for giving this pack a second chance to do right by you, for being exactly who you are." The move happened quickly, efficiently, with more help than I knew what to do with. Pack members I'd never met arrived at my cabin with boxes and willing hands, packing up my meager belongings with care and respect that made my eyes burn. They treated my things, worn and humble as they were, like they mattered, like I mattered. The cottage was beautiful in a way that made my breath catch. Small but well-built, with large windows that let in abundant light, a modern kitchen, a comfortable bedroom, and a living space with a stone fireplace. It sat at the edge of the residential area as River had promised, close enough to be protected, but far enough to offer privacy. "Do you like it?" Damon's voice came from behind me as I stood in the center of the living room, trying to process that this was real, that this was mine. I turned to find him and Cole in the doorway, both of them watching me with expressions that held hope and uncertainty in equal measure. "It's perfect," I said honestly. "I can't believe... I never thought..." "You deserve this," Cole said, moving into the room with Damon following. "You deserve so much more than this, but it's a start." They helped me unpack, the three of us working together with easy coordination that felt natural, right? We laughed over my collection of stones from the forest, over the poorly made curtains I'd sewn myself, over the single battered cookbook that was my only luxury. "Stay for dinner," I said impulsively when the work was done. "Let me cook for you. It's the least I can do after—" "We'd love to," Damon interrupted before I could finish the deflection. I made soup from the fresh ingredients in my new kitchen, better equipped than anything I'd had access to before, while they sat at my small table and told me about their day. It was domestic and comfortable and achingly normal in the best possible way. "The pack wants to hold a gathering," Cole said as we ate, "to formally recognize what you did. Father thinks it would be good for morale, good for unity, but he wants your permission first." "A gathering?" The thought made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Like, everyone?" "You don't have to," Damon said quickly, reading my discomfort. "If it's too much, we'll tell Father no. Your comfort matters more than tradition." But I thought about River's words, about resonance, about people wanting to understand, about the possibility that my story might matter to others who felt invisible, who struggled to find their place. "Okay," I said, surprising myself. "I'll do it." The gathering happened 3 days later, giving me just enough time to panic and nearly back out a dozen times. But each time fear threatened to overwhelm me, I thought about dragging 2 dying wolves through the snow, about the courage I'd found when it mattered most, and I steadied myself. The main hall was packed with pack members, more wolves than I'd seen in one place in years, their energy filling the space with warmth and noise and life. I stood near the entrance with Damon and Cole flanking me like guards, their presence a comfort and a strength I borrowed when my own threatened to fail. River called the gathering to order, his voice cutting through the noise with alpha authority. He spoke about the rogue threat, about the attack on his sons, about the debt the pack owed to courage shown in darkness and cold. "Emma," he said, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. "Come forward." My legs felt like water, but I walked toward him with my head high, aware of every eye on me, every whisper that followed my progress. Damon and Cole moved with me, staying close, a silent statement of support that didn't go unnoticed. River placed his hand on my shoulder when I reached him, a gesture of acceptance, of claiming, of protection. "This Omega saved my sons when they would have died otherwise," he said to the assembled pack. "She asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, but she deserves everything we can give. From this day forward, Emma is under the protection of the Alpha's family directly. Anyone who threatens her threatens us all." The declaration sent ripples through the crowd. Shock, approval, calculation, respect. It was more than I had expected, more than I had dreamed possible. Direct Alpha protection was reserved for the most valued pack members, for those whose loss would diminish the pack itself. "Additionally," River continued, "I'm appointing Emma as pack liaison for Omegas and vulnerable members. Her experience, her compassion, her understanding of what it means to struggle. These are assets this pack needs. She will have authority to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves, to ensure no one else is forgotten at the edges of our territory." I stared at him, stunned. A position of authority for an Omega? It was unheard of, revolutionary, dangerous in its implications for traditional hierarchy. But as I looked out at the crowd, I saw faces lighting up with hope. Other Omegas, Betas who had struggled, wolves who had felt invisible. I saw what this meant to them, what it could mean for the pack's future. "I accept," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "and I promise to serve with the same courage and compassion that this pack has shown me." The gathering erupted in applause, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not as an inconvenience to be managed, not as a weakness to be hidden, but as someone with value, with purpose, with a place. Damon's hand found mine, squeezing gently. On my other side, Cole's shoulder pressed against mine. The 3 of us stood together before the pack, and something shifted in the air, an acknowledgement of connection, of bonds forming that went deeper than duty or gratitude. The celebration that followed was overwhelming, but joyful. Pack members approached me with stories, with thanks, with requests for help, with situations they'd struggled with alone. I listened to each one, making mental notes, beginning to understand the scope of what I'd taken on. As the night wore on, Damon and Cole guided me out to a quieter balcony where the stars were visible above the forest canopy. The cold air was refreshing after the warmth inside, and I breathed deeply, trying to process everything that had happened. "You were incredible in there," Damon said softly, his golden eyes warm on my face. "The way you spoke, the way you stood before the pack. You were born for this, Emma. I was terrified," I admitted with a shaky laugh. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Cole quoted, echoing his father's earlier words. "It's acting despite it. And you, Emma." He paused, his amber-green eyes serious. "You're the bravest person we know." They stood on either side of me, close enough that I could feel their warmth, their strength, their solid presence. Something had been building between the three of us for days now, something that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. "I need to tell you something," Damon said, his voice dropping lower. "Both of us do." My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked between them, seeing the intensity in both sets of eyes, the vulnerability beneath their alpha confidence. "When you saved us," Cole began, "something changed. We felt it even then, through the pain and the cold and the fear. A connection that shouldn't have been possible, that defied everything we understood about pack bonds. We're drawn to you," Damon continued, his hand finding mine again, "not just because you saved us, though we'll never stop being grateful for that, but because of who you are, your strength, your compassion, your courage. Because when we're with you, we're better versions of ourselves." "What are you saying?" I asked, though part of me already knew, already felt it in the way my heart raced, in the heat that bloomed under my skin. "That we want you," Cole said simply. "Both of us. Not as an obligation or a debt, but as a choice. As partners, if you'll have us." It was unconventional, possibly scandalous, definitely complicated. 2 alpha heirs and an omega who had been exiled. The pack would have opinions, concerns, judgments. But as I looked at them, these 2 men who had seen me at my most ordinary and found something extraordinary, who had respected my strength even when others saw only weakness, I realized that the only opinion that mattered was mine. "Yes," I said, the word both simple and profound. "I choose you too. Both of you." Damon's smile was brilliant, transforming his face with joy. Cole's was softer but no less genuine, relief and happiness evident in every line. They moved closer, and for a moment the 3 of us simply stood together, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, beginning something new and terrifying and wonderful. "This won't be easy," I warned them, needing them to understand. "People will talk. There will be challenges to your father's authority, questions about my fitness to stand beside you." "Let them talk," Damon said firmly. "Let them question. We know what you are, what you're capable of, and we'll prove it to anyone who doubts." "Together," Cole added, his hand joining ours. "The 3 of us, together. That's how we'll face everything." The months that followed were indeed challenging. There were pack members who disapproved, who saw my elevation as a threat to traditional hierarchy. There were rogues who tested the borders, requiring vigilance and strength. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the old fears rose up to whisper that I didn't belong, that this couldn't last. But Damon and Cole were there through all of it, steady and sure, their faith in me never wavering. And slowly, through my work as liaison, through the changes I helped implement, through the wolves I helped find their voices, the pack began to transform. River watched it all with eyes that grew less cold, more approving. He had taken a risk on me, had offered me a chance when he could have simply maintained the status quo. And I had proven him right, proven that courage and compassion were strengths, not weaknesses. A year after the night I dragged 2 freezing black wolves inside my cabin, I stood in that same main hall for another gathering. But this time, I stood beside Damon and Cole not as their savior or their project, but as their equal partner, their chosen mate, their future. The bonding ceremony was beautiful and simple, conducted by River himself, with the entire pack as witnesses. When he placed our hands together, mine pale and small between their darker, larger ones, and declared us bound by choice and by love, I felt the rightness of it in my bones. "From 3 separate paths," River said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. One unified future, from isolation and pain, connection and strength. This is what pack means, not the dominance of the powerful over the weak, but the choice to lift each other up, to honor each person's unique gifts, to create something stronger together than any of us could be alone. The pack's approval resonated through the room, a wave of acceptance and celebration that washed over me like warmth. That night, in the cottage that had become our home, expanded now to accommodate 3 lives intertwining, I stood at the window and looked out at the forest that had once been my prison and my refuge. The trees were dark against the star-filled sky, peaceful and beautiful, holding no more fear. Damon's arms came around me from behind, his chin resting on my head. Cole appeared at my side, his hand finding mine. The 3 of us stood together in the quiet, breathing in sync, hearts beating in time. "Do you ever think about that night?" Cole asked softly. "About what would have happened if you hadn't come out into the storm?" "Sometimes," I admitted. But then I remember that I did come out. I made the choice that mattered, and everything that came after, all of this, grew from that single moment of deciding to help when help was needed. "You saved more than our lives that night," Damon said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved us in ways that go deeper than breathing, showed us what real strength looks like, what courage means." "You saved me too," I said quietly. I was surviving in that cabin, but I wasn't living. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to matter, to have a purpose beyond simply enduring another day. "We see you," Cole promised, turning me to face them both. "Every day, in every way. We see you, Emma, and we love what we see." The kiss we shared was gentle and deep, full of promise and possibility, sealing bonds that had been forged in cold and darkness and had grown into something unbreakable in the light. Outside, the forest was still. Inside, 3 hearts beat as one. And somewhere in the darkness, the story of an Omega who had saved 2 alphas, who had transformed a pack, who had proven that the greatest strength was found not in dominance but in compassion, became legend. But for me, it was simply the beginning of a life I had never dared to dream. A life of belonging, of purpose, of love freely given and joyfully received. The storm had passed. Spring was coming, and I was finally, completely,